Thank you, Tom. We have 18 minutes for questions, and then Bob Hathaway wants to have a minute for announcements. Hands for questions. Again, as somebody said, I can see hands, but I can't see who's raising hands. Yes. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Hunter Grimes from State INR. My question is for Taylor. First, a quick observation. This is my second conference this week, and a number of panelists have used the term mutwa, military operations other than war, to describe what the Chinese are talking about. You're the first one to very accurately point out that they refer to it as non-war military activities, and that they are not directly analogous to our mutwa. So thank you for that. My question, though, and you alluded to it in your talk, is the topic of resources. You mentioned it as one of your conventional wisdoms, and you alluded to it elsewhere as the choices that they're faced with today come with resource allocation answers that they have to apply to them. Briefly, can you describe how or where you think those resources will be most applied, where they'll be least applied, given the drivers of modernization that you laid out in your talk?
Great. Thanks for the question. Probably impossible to give a short answer. I think the very quick answer would be that one could maybe think about there being, I'm here just totally going off script, but there may be two PLAs out there. There's sort of a modern coastal PLA that looks at Taiwan, and there's a slightly, but that's modernizing at a faster rate. That's going to get more resources, and some of the other weapon systems and assets that you would want in a conflict over Taiwan get priority. And then you have sort of this PLA that's modernizing less quickly, that would focus on a lot of the continental missions because of the nature of the potential adversaries and the nature of the conflicts. They don't need to necessarily be able to fight the kind of high-intensity, highly destructive war that is envisioned with the United States, and so resources may be allocated in that way. Although it's obviously, well, you're from INR, you probably know better than I. I hope you know better than I that how the PLA actually does allocate its resources. They don't tell us very much in these white papers, and although I think the PLA is quite or there's a lot of data about doctrine and about a lot of things associated with modernization. One would have to kind of build up from the ground if you were looking at a lot of these open sources, how resources are being allocated. But I would say it's broad-based, and the one point I want to make here is that since 2005, there's been a second effort to rejuvenate frontier and coastal defense, and almost every day in the PLA Daily or the JFN Jianbao, there's an article on some frontier defense regiment that's implemented some new form of training, and it just goes to show that securing a border that's 22,000 kilometers long is the task of the PLA and does require some drain on their resources. So that's an imperfect answer to what's a very good question.
Yes.
Hello? Oh. I'd like to talk to Dan and Taylor about a question. Earlier in the week, I went to the Senate Appropriations meeting with Secretary of Defense Gates, and Admiral Mullen was there. And the definite message they expressed at that meeting was obviously they're expecting some serious cutbacks in the Pentagon. There's going to be some serious budgetary decisions about what weapon systems are made, where cuts are going to be made. Robert Kaplan wrote an article a couple months ago talking about the shrinking of the U.S. Navy, at least surface ship-wise. And so my question to you is that Tom mentioned that Dan's approach was a realist approach dealing with power and presence and so forth, and Taylor was talking about whether the Chinese are actually doing what they hope to do and their goals and so forth. I want to turn it around and say, how is America, you talk about the status quo, Tom, are we going to be able to maintain the status quo in the Asia-Pacific? Because it seems to me that there is a zero-sum thing here, and that deals with finances, the ability to pay and to project U.S. power in the Asia-Pacific. And there is, and you guys probably know, but there are some very serious questions throughout the region. Is the United States going to have the presence or be able to have the presence in the future that they've had since World War II? And I think all of these strategies, all these theories that we've talked about the last couple of days here are really depending on whether we have the resources, especially financial resources, to implement them. If not, are we going to have a defense policy, what Brent Scowcroft calls a more modest and more pragmatic defense policy in the future?
Okay. Well, thank you. That's a great question, and I would argue that and in fact, I think many Admiral Roughhead of the Navy and General North at Pacific Command and others have alluded to the same issue, which is we have obligations upon which our allies are counting, presence obligations, deterrence obligations, and at least the way they see it, some of the Chinese deployments, particularly in the missile forces and in the submarine and undersea forces, are making some of those making the countries in the region, and I think this is the key point, the perception among the countries in the region that we won't be able to do the kinds of things that we have been doing since the end of World War II. I think that is creating a dynamic of its own today. So there is a broad-based military modernization going on throughout Asia. Part of it is a reaction to China. Part of it is a reaction to uncertainties about us. So Australia is undertaking a major military modernization. India is undertaking a major military modernization. Singapore, and so on, and Japan has all kinds of problems, but it's not about to take away the military instrument. So the question, so I would go a step back from your question and say, do we have the resources? And the question about whether we have the resources is more a question of, do we want to raise the resources to accomplish something? Now, we're still a rich country, obviously not as relatively rich as we were. But one of the reasons that I would say that has launched me on this particular project is that all presidents since the end of the Cold War, in one way or another, have talked about hedging against China's rise, maintaining a favorable balance of power. We heard from Secretary Steinberg yesterday, in one way or another, if obliquely, that our presence around the region is a stabilizing force. What I'm trying to do is to try to parse out what the requirements are for that hedging balancing policy that all presidents say we need. Now, now, to sort of answer your question, if a president decided that, for a variety of reasons, that actually shouldn't and can't be our policy anymore, then there wouldn't be any reason to raise the resources to meet the policy prescriptions, right? But no one has decided that yet. So what you're kind of describing is a bit of strategic insolvency, right? So presidents and military leaders go out to Asia and say, "Don't worry, we're engaged, we're present, we can protect you, we can defend you," and then there's a fight for resources inside the defense budget. And if you look at the number, and I think Robert Kaplan's analysis is right, if you look at the numbers, pure numbers, which again I warn against looking at pure numbers, but the size of our Navy, the size of our air forces, the migration of forces to Central Asia from the Asia Pacific, you see an erosion. There's no, I mean, just a fact, across administrations, you see an erosion of presence capabilities. So if you're continuing to define your most basic fundamental goal in Asia as ensuring stability through a favorable balance of power, and then you're not willing to put the resources behind it, or you don't have the resources anymore, let's say in extremis, then you are. It's not like the other players in the region don't notice that; they notice the gap. So, again, Singapore, Australia, they know how many F-35s will be deployed, and they know that the F-22 program was cut. Some of the things Taylor was talking about, which is exactly right, and that's how you think about a balance, right? Is the anti-ship ballistic missile could or could not be a game changer depending on what we do, right? So it could be, if we decide that it is, and don't deploy more in terms of directed energy and SM-3 and so forth, and then we've sort of accepted that. If we decide it's not something we want to be a game changer, then we would put more resources towards some of those capabilities Taylor's talking about. So again, I think part of the reasons to do these assessments of where we are in the relative balance of power is, again, to decide if it's worth it. And to see if we're actually insolvent in the sense of this is where we say we want to be and this is where we are. And that's how I'd answer that basic question. Do you have any more?
Yes.
That's all right.
Stapleton Roy, Kissinger Institute. Maintaining international security obviously involves a very important military component, but there's also a diplomatic component. Taylor referred to the fact that one of China's objectives is to maintain an external stability so conducive to economic growth. Conceivably, if U.S. resources are constrained by our slow recovery from the financial crisis, we ought to have a diplomatic goal of maintaining an environment that would enable us to lower defense spending without damaging international security. Neither of you have touched on this aspect. I wonder if you could offer some thoughts as to whether there ought to be some coordination between our diplomatic strategy and our military-based international security strategy.
Absolutely. I didn't touch upon it in part just in terms of the brief that I was given, but certainly as an outsider who, in the academy sitting up in Massachusetts, when one looks at the defense budget and the State Department budget, it's a pretty stark contrast. And I think all of these questions, and Tom has mentioned this in his comments and in an earlier panel, I mean, although we're talking about the military issues, we want to think of them in terms of all the components of national power, and I think American diplomacy is one of those that would be very important in terms of maintaining our presence, because I think some of the anxieties that Dan talks about is not just in terms of the assets that we have in the region, but how often we show up to meetings, what role we play in these meetings, and so forth. And so I couldn't agree with you more. It seems to me that it is in part a function of how we're willing to allocate resources internally, and it seems like we need to build out our diplomatic corps. And I know that I don't need to tell you this, but it strikes me that just from what I hear, the embassy in Beijing has got to be one of the toughest places to work right now in terms of tempo, probably after Iraq and Afghanistan, and that just suggests how much work needs to be done in that one capital. I don't even know when we start thinking about the entire Asia Pacific region. So I couldn't agree more.
Just a couple of additional sentences to that. Again, I absolutely agree with the question the way Taylor ended it, that diplomacy and the other instruments of national power have got to be brought more fully into use, not just because that's smart to do, but also because we're less able to rely on the military for budget reasons. And I think the answer tells. But an element of this, I think, is we should anticipate more U.S. interest in divisions of labor, greater contributions by our allies and partners, and expectations that are going to run up against, again, from other panels, domestic politics in those countries, budgetary problems in those countries, asking for a kind of a cultural change away from quasi-free rider status because the Americans would always dig deeper and pick it up, and we may not. So there's going to be a part of that diplomatic strategy is going to be, I think, working with partners and allies for more multilateral, more burden-sharing kinds of approaches that we haven't actually done in a while.
I would say absolutely. I mean, I'm sort of a traditionalist, statecraft, right? I mean, we don't need to separate categories. Diplomacy and the military instrument always need to be tied together in whatever you're doing. But you can create all kinds of dynamics. So if you're focusing on a diplomacy that sort of sets the stage for less military obligation, you have to be very careful about how your allies, particularly in a dynamic region like this, where they have a lot of capability, will react to what you think is being assuring. They actually take as not very assuring. And on the point that Tom just made, this is a very nuanced statecraft, and I'm getting beyond my script here, because you want your allies to take on more responsibility, but you also don't want military competitions in the region. And it goes back to Jonathan Pollock's point about the investment in insurance. We've had a very successful Asia in large measure because we took on the security guarantees, and they didn't have to acquire, countries that didn't acquire WMD and other destabilizing types of weapons. So we don't want, to coin a phrase, we don't want Asia to look like pre-World War I Europe, where they're competing and so forth. So you have to, very nuanced. You want them all to have military capability, but just so much, really.
I would add to that you can already see the beginnings of an arms race in Asia. Sheffer mentioned yesterday Vietnam ordering 8 new submarines, and I don't want to list military hardware, but we see the same thing in Singapore, India, Australia, and many other countries. One last question?
Yes, sir. You had a lot of hands.
Okay, yes.
TJ Pempel from UC Berkeley. I want to take this down a theoretical notch because in many respects